Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
This week marks the philosopher David Hume's 300th birthday, and we plan to discuss why his ideas are still so important and relevant today.
Now, Hume was famous in his own lifetime as being a skeptic, an infidel, an atheist. These words were thrown about endlessly. He was interested in the traditional claim, a claim which is almost as old as philosophy, that we have been endowed with the capacity for reason, a capacity for reason and for reasoning, which will furnish us, if we use it properly, with knowledge about the world, about the natural world, about the supernatural world, and about our place within it. Hume was interested in this traditional claim, and his skepticism arises out of the way in which he challenges this claim. But Hume found reason to dismiss this claim altogether. He found there was no ground for believing that reason had the power to organize the mind, to furnish us with these different orders of knowledge. Instead, he concluded the dynamic power which drives the workings of what we like to think of as the mind is in fact the imagination. The organizing principle of what we like to think of as the mind is in fact custom, habit, convention. The sort of experience, the cognitive experience, the moral experience we acquire from everyday life in society in which we move. And what matters, and what makes Hume a world historical figure in this respect, is that this was understood by his most intelligent and most perceptive religious Christian readers. And what matters in world historical terms is their response. Hume's fellow Scot, Thomas Reid at Aberdeen, and much more potently and powerfully in Königsberg from Immanuel Kant. Two philosophers who realized that the foundations of knowledge had been gravely shaken, and much more than that, our Christian understanding had been gravely shaken and needed to be rebuilt. In this respect, Hume's skepticism is one of the milestones between the early modernity and the modernity of the world in which we live. Hume starts off life as a philosopher, writes his extraordinary but little read treatise of human nature, develops themes in that theory of human nature in the decade after its publication, but then does something which used to shock philosophers to their very, very core. He put down his philosophical pen and turned to the writing of history. And not just the writing of all histories, but the writing of the history of England. He begins to do it in the late 1740s. He started by the 1750s, and he will spend the next decade writing a 6-volume history of England. It's an odd story, actually. He started with the most modern volumes, the volumes on the history of James I and Charles I, and then went on to the later Jameses and Charleses and ended with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. He then went back to the Tudors, and having gone back from the Tudors, got as far as the beginning of the Tudors, he then went back to the beginning and to the Roman invasion. And as one of his sterner critics said, like the witches, he said his prayers backwards. Although Hume was slagged off as a skeptic and an infidel, and quite rightly, he was a skeptic and he was an infidel and made no secret of it. The interesting thing is his history is greatly admired even by people who are made to feel uncomfortable by his philosophy. To put it briefly, his history becomes a bestseller. It's published everywhere, it's translated everywhere. it's a sensational commercial success, and indeed it is also, in contemporary terms, a sensational historiographical success, because Hume was seen to have done for English history what had proved to be impossible. That is to say, to write an impartial history which was untarnished by party political wrangling. And he did it in a way which gave him a mass readership. His narratives move very fast, they are extraordinarily nuanced, and they're designed, in fact, to expose problems which we may wish to pause on and to develop. The order of problems which interested Hume were twofold. One was the problem of how ought we to judge the performance of the rulers of the past? The danger isn't we judge them by the standards of the present. If we're going to judge them by the standards of their own time, what are those standards to be? They must have something to do with the problem of how they managed the political world of their own time, how they understood the constitution and the method and the mode of government of their own time. And this led to the second thing. His lesson to the English was that you do not understand the nature of your constitution now, you do not understand the nature of the history of your constitution. Go back to the skepticism. Hume says all our cognitive skills are in fact acquired skills. We organize, ordinary life from birth to death teaches us to exercise our various cognitive skills in order to make sense of the world in which we find ourselves. They are acquired. The message in all of that is that if you want to understand your own mind, it is best to start off with yourself, with actually an autobiographical exercise in looking at the history of your own belief system. And where Hume's historicity comes from is this extremely powerful, laminated view of human nature and of history as a discipline. It begins philosophically with the self. It moves out to the history of a particular civil society. It moves beyond that to the history of civilization.
Okay, so first of all, a word about progress in philosophy. It's very easy to cast stones at philosophers and say, look at all these problems that you're addressing, they never get solved. It's not actually true. Philosophers do solve problems, but after the problems are solved, they tend to be taken out of the domain of philosophy and they're no longer called that anymore. So progress by philosophers, if you look back at the 17th and 18th centuries, there's tons of it. Bacon, Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire, etc. One could go on. Huge strides being made in the political arena, notably, thought about religion, and thought about physical science. Natural philosophers. Of course, we don't now call them natural philosophers. We call them physicists or whatever. But at the time, people were working out how to solve new types of problem. And that's where philosophers come in, where you've got a discipline that is not yet fully formed, where we're not quite sure how to solve the problems, or even what the appropriate methods are. And that's where you will find philosophers particularly working. So if you look back at past generations of philosophers, their successes can be found typically in what are now established disciplines. You can see Hume's influence in a huge amount of modern science. Just to take a couple of particularly striking examples, Hume is very keen to emphasize the continuity between humans and the animal world. Charles Darwin was reading Hume at the time he came up with the theory of evolution. In fact, Hume is one of the most frequently cited authors by Darwin in his lists. The big message that comes out of Hume's philosophy is the empiricist one. That is, a priori, sitting in our armchair, we can't possibly tell how the world works. The only way to find out how things work is by experience and observation. Now, if you look at the progress of modern science, take quantum mechanics, for example, it's clear there that the establishment of quantum mechanics a theory that seems madly paradoxical in many ways, not possibly a theory that anyone would have come up with just sitting in their armchair as a likely speculation about how the world works. We've been driven to that by hard experimental observation. So I think one can see the progress of modern science as being very much in the Humean spirit. Okay, you might say again, that battle's been won. Why do we still need to read Hume? Well, Hume still has a lot to offer in areas which are now at the boundaries. For example, cognitive science. There's a new interdisciplinary field, a lot of questions arising about the relation between human thought, artificial intelligence, bringing in linguistics, and computer science, all sorts of different areas coming together. And there are big questions about how things should be addressed there. Now, one of the great virtues of studying, if you like, classic philosophers, great minds of the past, is that it can help you to look with a more realistic perspective, a more detached perspective, at the particular fashions of the day. And topical example comes in economics. It's very interesting that economics is an exception to what I was saying earlier about science generally being empirical these days. What our economists have typically done is to use an a priori model of human behavior based on the assumption that everybody is a rational utility maximizer. I think that is a very pervasive thought. It's as well to be reminded by Hume that it's not necessarily a correct thought. In fact, Hume very nicely refutes it. So let's suppose we take a particular case. There's an earthquake. A nurse volunteers to help the victims of the earthquake. So she nurses some chap who's been hurt in the earthquake. Why does she do it? Well, this is the way the a priori thought goes. She must desire this guy's getting better. Okay, so why is she nursing him? Well, it must be because she desires him to get better. So she's actually only doing it in order to satisfy her desire. So actually, she's selfish after all. It's the only reason she's doing this nursing is because she foresees the satisfaction of her desire and the consequent pleasure. Well, this is what Hume says about this kind of reasoning. And he alludes back to Joseph Butler. It has been proved that even the passions commonly esteemed selfish carry the mind beyond self directly to the object. That though the satisfaction of these passions gives us enjoyment, yet the prospect of this enjoyment is not the cause of the passion, but on the contrary, the passion is antecedent to the enjoyment, and without the former, the latter could never possibly exist. So what he's saying is the reason why the nurse gets pleasure when her patient recovers is that she desires the recovery of the patient. If she didn't have that unselfish desire to start with, there would be no pleasure at the end. Philosophy is a difficult subject. When one's trying to make progress, you have to try to think outside the box. That can be a very difficult thing to do, particularly if you're thinking in an area where there's a lot of discussion that's going along particular lines. I find going back and looking at Hume, a very ambitious philosopher, who's trying to connect lots of different areas together, it forces me to think through what he's saying in my own terms. And this is an important point about why we're constantly reinterpreting the philosophers of the past. Sometimes Hume will make a connection, because he's such an ambitious philosopher, trying to connect these different areas. He will say something, and I, in trying to think through what he's saying, will see something, get an idea that I'd never have got otherwise. And this is why I think reading really great minds of the past, and there aren't that many of Hume's caliber, very few, but reading these great minds of the past with their very ambitious, all-embracing thoughts, linking together all these different areas, is still a very enriching thing to do, and actually brings real progress in contemporary philosophy. It's not just an historical exercise. I don't think it's a coincidence that Hume is so fruitful. He's really by far the greatest philosopher of the early modern period to have developed a philosophy which is, as far as possible, independent of religion. So we are now in the business of trying to do things like make sense of morality, in a way that does not depend on religion. I don't think it's at all surprising that we find that many of the avenues that Hume was the first to pioneer have proved to be so fruitful, and I think will continue to be so for a long time to come.
Our understanding, the understanding derived from behavioral sciences and evolution, the way that we understand the cognitive processes involved in our moral judgments means philosophy is almost an anachronism, or certainly moral philosophy is no longer necessary to explain anything. How do you think Hume would have responded to that idea?
I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. Does cognitive science make philosophy irrelevant? And actually, it focuses very much on an area of philosophy that is of tremendous current interest amongst Hume scholars. And it's this, trying to get some objectivity in there. I mean, the task of moral philosophy isn't just to find out how we react in certain circumstances. It's also to find ways of judging what is good from a more objective point of view. And one of the things that Hume is very keen to do, both in his moral philosophy and in his aesthetics, is to find a kind of objectivity there that comes from the uniformity or intersubjectivity, if you like, of our reactions. So he doesn't want to say aesthetics is just bunk, morality is just bunk. But I think very much we can see the problem that we're faced with as the very problem that Hume is addressing. And it's not something that we can just sweep under the carpet, because we do want to carry on making moral judgments, don't we? And we want to aspire at least to make them in a way that is at least objective, not in the sense maybe of reflecting the nature of the universe, but at least reflecting the nature of humanity in such a way that we can converse together and agree on them.
What was it that made Hume this amazing figure? Is it just that he was a random genius, as it were? Is it something about his time that made it possible for him to be this amazing figure that Nicholas described? Is it something about his upbringing?
What I would focus on with Hume, more than anything, I think, is his ruthless honesty, as well as being his very, very sharp logical insight. So he writes in a letter about how he produced a book written before the age of 20 about his struggles with religion. And he says it was a struggle of restless imagination against inclination. He really wanted to believe the traditional story, but he kept coming up with arguments and worries about it, and he worried away at them and dug, and eventually came to the conclusion that the religious beliefs he'd been brought up with were false. So I think that's the character of the man. He won't settle for an easy answer. He's obviously extremely intelligent and insightful, but also ruthlessly honest.
Skepticism, and a fairly radical form of skepticism, was a well-known discipline in every church in Europe, in every confession, as a way of knocking bright, young, troubled divinity students into shape. You could say, okay, if you're a skeptic, if you don't believe in God, here are all sorts of proofs. And there's some very, very sophisticated skepticism around in Europe in the post-revolution, Reformation era. And what you would do would be that you would work the divinity student over, and you would say, so you believe in nothing, but you exist. I mean, you're going to turn into a crank, you're going to turn into a psychological misfit and all the rest of it. And it is quite possible that Hume himself was given a bit of that discipline by his uncle. His father died when he was young. His mother was a delightful woman, but had no claims to being an intellectual at all. His guardian was his uncle, who was a high-flying Presbyterian minister, who Hume clearly didn't like. It is not totally impossible that Hume was introduced to skepticism by an uncle who wanted to show the impossibility of skepticism as a way of not just understanding yourself and the world, but actually of being able to live sanely.